Thank you so much to Rabbi Werber and to Cantor Rosen and to Joyce. It's so beautiful. It's so wonderful to be here. And we're really proud to have both Rabbi Werber and Cantor Rosen, and I believe all of the clergy, past and present, of CBST as members of Drashah. So Rabbi Werber already talked about this in-between place that we find ourselves in the Jewish calendar. And Judaism, as we know, is both very good at making distinctions, right? We praise God for turning day into night, for giving the ability, la'avchin bein yom uvein laila, turn day into night. We start Shabbat as we did by lighting candles. We end with Havdalah. So we are very good at making distinctions, but we're also very good at having these in-between places. So whether it's in the calendar, like you spoke about, or the moment that we find ourselves in right now, Bein Hashmashot, this twilight, the time of Kabbalat Shabbat, which also in the days of creation is the moment when God is supposed to have created many magical things, like the mouth of Bilam's talking donkey that we read about last week, for example. And we also, in this moment in the Torah reading cycle, we find ourselves in the Midbar, in the wilderness, this kind of in-between place between slavery and redemption. So these can be frustrating places, but they're also places of wisdom. We get Torah in the Midbar. These magical creations happen Bein Hashmashot in twilight. So since our topic tonight is drawing the line between criticism of Israel and anti-Semitism, I want to say that there's many people who just wish we could just define it and make it really clear. But actually, we often are Bein Hashmashot. We're in the in-between. And I think that this is a place that we can look for some wisdom, though I also will try to make some order out of things. So I want to start by mentioning, of course, what's on many of our minds, the horrific, violent, anti-Semitic attacks that we've seen, unfortunately, over the last few months. The murders of Yaron Lashinsky and Sarah Milgram at the Capitol Museum in D.C., the firebombing in Boulder that killed Karen Diamond and wounded many more. And thankfully there weren't casualties, but the arson at Governor Josh Shapiro's home on Seder night. And we could add to this list many attempted violent attacks that, thank God, didn't come to be. So after each of these attacks, there were voices arguing about whether these were or were not anti-Semitism. So we had some voices saying, well, these were actually political because the perpetrators were doing it because they were mad at Israel, because they were in solidarity with Palestinians. In all of these attacks that I mentioned, the perpetrators either said Free Palestine or said that they were doing it for Palestine at some point in the course of the attack or in the aftermath. So there were voices saying, look, these are political, these are not anti-Semitic. And then there were other voices saying, well, this is proof that even the words Free Palestine or really any pro-Palestine activism are anti-Semitic in and of themselves, that the whole movement is anti-Semitic. So I want to go Bein Hashmashot and say it's not this nor that, that we're certainly not going to discount the anti-Semitism of these attacks, but we're also not going to use them to paint an entire movement as anti-Semitic. And that is particularly important in this moment when, on the one hand, we're witnessing tragic anti-Semitic violence and are, I'm guessing, all of us very scared of what else could happen. And on the other hand, when the Trump administration is cynically using anti-Semitism as an excuse to shut down free speech, to attack universities, to strip away medical funding, and to dismantle democracy. So we have to be really careful to talk about when it's anti-Semitism, when it's not, to figure out how we're going to preserve democracy and fight anti-Semitism, which, of course, are not actually opposed to each other. So in trying to make some sense of that, I want to start by saying something that is maybe obvious, but maybe not, which is that Israel is a country. And that should be obvious, but sometimes we talk about Israel as an idea, as a project, as a vision. It's a country like the United States or any other country. And like any other country, it has international human rights obligations and can be called out when it doesn't live up to those standards. I'll say, I'm not going to talk more about this, but I'll also say that non-state actors like Hamas also have international law obligations, which they have also violated in horrific and tragic ways. So I'm not going to go into the details of the ways in which Israel or Hamas or the United States or any other country have violated their international human rights obligations, but just to say that is the obligation of a country, and you can call them out for violations. So when Americans or anybody else protests the war in Gaza or advocates for a change in U.S. policy regarding Israel or regarding anything else, that's not anti-Semitism. I'm not going to advocate for this. I'm not going to advocate for vandalism at all anywhere. But if, for example, somebody decided to spray paint Free Palestine on the Israeli consulate here in New York, that would be like spray painting Slava Ukraini, which I probably just mispronounced, on the Russian consulate, right? That's a political act. Again, please don't do it. But just want to be clear. Don't want anybody to leave home and say I said to go spray paint. Okay. But when anger about Israeli government policy spills over into harassment or violence at Jews or Jewish institutions in the United States or any other country, that is anti-Semitism. And it doesn't make it any less anti-Semitic to say that this violence is only directed toward Zionists or Zionist Jews. That suggestion misunderstands the very nature of Jews. Probably everybody in this room knows this, but I'll say it, that Judaism isn't just a faith. It's not just about where you pray. It's not just about ritual. We are also a people with a history, with a set of ritual and cultural practices, with a sacred language, with many vernacular languages, and with a homeland. So I'm not going to get into all of the definitions of Zionism. We could be here till tomorrow, and I do have to get home for candlelighting. But we can just say that there's many definitions of Zionism, and there are many reasons that the vast majority of Jews and Jewish institutions in the world, whether you call it Zionism or not, have a strong connection with Israel. Those include because that's where half of the Jewish people live, and we have a sense of Klal Yisrael, of the entirety of Jews, and that includes having a responsibility of care toward Jews everywhere in the world, including in Israel. Of course, the land of Israel is the Jewish homeland. We have so much history there. And unfortunately, our history has tragically taught us that few other countries have provided safety for Jews in the long term. So one can love and care for Israel and its people while also harshly criticizing the government's actions, because it's a country. And certainly any of the hundreds of thousands of Israelis who have been marching the street for more than 2 years to fight for democracy and now to demand a hostage deal and a ceasefire could tell you that you can fiercely love a country and fight for it to be better. Probably anybody who was in the street in New York yesterday or any other time, including, I'm sure, some people here, could also tell you that. And of course, there's many Jews, including likely some in the room or on live stream tonight, who identify as anti-Zionist, which also has many, many meetings that I'm not going to try to go into tonight, different speech. And I want to say straight out that Jews who define themselves as anti-Zionist are just as Jewish as any other Jews, despite what some communal leaders might say. Right? We're not going to make categories of which Jews are in, which Jews are out, depending on your political persuasions. There's also a risk sometimes of anti-Zionist Jews being tokenized and used as shields by those who want to say, well, those are the good Jews based on their politics, and so then it's okay to subject the bad Jews to intimidation and violence, and that's also not okay. So I want to go back to these attacks I mentioned, DC, Boulder, Harrisburg. We could add others to the list. Some people have said, as I alluded to, well, Yaron and Sarah, they worked for the embassy, they were attending an event on Israel, so it wasn't anti-Semitism, it was politics. By the way, there's no evidence that the perpetrator actually knew their identities. They were at an event at a Jewish museum. And the Boulder Jews, well, they were marching for hostages, they were holding Israeli flags, some people say, and, well, Josh Shapiro, he's a political leader, he's affirmed his connection to Israel. But what these arguments all miss is that the targets of all of these attacks were engaged in expressions of concern for Klal Yisrael, for all of Israel, for all the Jewish people, and that's a concern that extends to Israeli Jews as well. When it comes to the Boulder attacks, for example, as unfortunately Jews worldwide have relearned since October 7th, Pidyon Shvuim, the redemption of captives, is a religious obligation, a mitzvah of the highest level. Our Sidurim have within them a prayer for the hostages that's many centuries old. It didn't get put in there on October 7th because unfortunately we've needed it many times in the past. So the Jews in Boulder were marching for the hostages because it's a mitzvah. It's a mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim. They were doing Judaism. The Capitol Museum is not the Israeli embassy, right? An attack on the Israeli embassy, again, would have been horrific, but that is a political institution. The Jewish Museum is a Jewish institution, which, by the way, was and is currently still hosting an exhibit about the history of LGBTQ Jews in D.C. An arson at the governor's home on Seder night is not the same as, let's say, something that is targeting the state capitol. Right? In all of these situations, these were Jews who were doing Judaism and who were violently attacked in the process. So to take another example that maybe more people agree on, remember the horrific, tragic murder of 11 Jews in Pittsburgh in 2018. If you remember, the motivation of the gunman was that he was angry because the shul was hosting refugee Shabbat. I didn't at the time hear anybody argue that that was a political murder because he was mad about immigrants coming into the United States. It was really clear to all of us that it was anti-Semitism. He was attacking Jews who were doing Judaism and for whom, like for many of us, protecting immigrants is part of how we practice our Judaism. And I'll also mention that impact also matters. When there's attacks on Jews and Jewish institutions, the impact is that it terrifies us. It terrifies all of us. We don't need to know exactly what was going on in the attacker's head in the moment. But okay, you might say, so there's some voices that are out there, like I mentioned before, who say, well, therefore, any protests of Israel are anti-Semitic because for some people, any protests of Israel are scary. And we have to be careful about this, as I said, because right now there are many in the Trump administration and also, unfortunately, inside the Jewish community who want to say that any action that's motivated by anti-Israel sentiment, by support for Palestinians, is anti-Semitic. There are many major Jewish leaders and institutions that have muddied the waters by saying that almost any criticism of Israel is anti-Semitic, and that's a little bit like crying wolf. It makes it harder to know when actually we're stepping into anti-Semitic territory. Some people have said that even protests of Israeli policy, calling for an end to arms sale or any other change in American policy, or even the display of Palestinian flags, of keffiyehs, even watermelons, is anti-Semitic. And it's especially dangerous right now when the Trump administration is trying to use Jews and anti-Semitism to dismantle democracy. We've seen anti-Semitism invoked as a reason to defund universities, to limit free speech, to detain foreign students and professors, supposedly all to protect Jews. None of this is protecting Jews. And in fact, these moves are likely to spark even more anti-Semitism if Jews are blamed for cuts in cancer funding, in the detention, deportation of foreign students. We also know that at times of economic and political upheaval, there tends to be a rise in anti-Semitism because people look around for someone to blame. So, because of these dangers, those of us who love and care about Israel have to be really clear in rejecting the misuse of anti-Semitism to suppress free speech or to destroy democracy and due process. And it's also important, at the same time, for pro-Palestine activists to make really clear distinctions, to make sure that protests are targeting policies, Israeli and American policies, and decision makers, not ordinary Jews or Jewish institutions, and that includes Jews who are showing solidarity with other Jews across the ocean. And so, to try to make things a little bit clearer, Ben Hashmashot, I want to give a very short list of some actions, this is not comprehensive, that are not inherently anti-Semitic. So criticizing Israeli policy, calling out Israeli human rights abuses, teaching Israeli and Palestinian history critically, just like hopefully we'll be able to continue teaching American history critically, which is also an expression of love for this country. Support for any political solution that doesn't involve expelling Israelis. So we can argue for days, years about whether that's two states, which is what I think is the most likely possible solution, but other people can make arguments for one binational state, for a confederation, for any other political entity that meets the standard that nobody has to leave, not Israelis, not Palestinians. Nonviolent protest, that could include boycotts, it could include protests of US or Israeli policy. And support for Palestinians or for Palestinian nationalism, that could include Palestinian flags and keffiyehs, just like one can be out there with an Israeli flag out of love and concern for Israel and not have somebody say, well, that is anti-Palestinian or anything else that you want to say. Now, I don't want to suggest that none of these things, so all of these things could be done in an anti-Semitic way, right? So context always matters when we're evaluating bias, but inherently, none of what I just mentioned is inherently anti-Semitic. But here's what is anti-Semitic. Using classic anti-Semitic tropes, like portraying Israel as the ultimate evil. We know that a lot of anti-Semitism manifests as a conspiracy theory about Jews controlling the world, pulling the levers of power. And so when we hear that it's Zionists who are pulling the levers of power, or that Israel has outsized power over the whole world, we can hear that those are classic anti-Semitic theories that are now just being rephrased to use the word Zionists instead of Jews. Holding Jews collectively responsible for Israeli policy, right? As American Jews, or I know people are from Scotland and all sorts of Ecuador, all sorts of places, but as American Jews or Jews anywhere in the world, we don't control Israeli policy, and one can't expect that Jews speak for the Israeli government. Denying Jewish history in the land of Israel, we hear sometimes this line that, well, today's Jews aren't real Jews. That also references an old anti-Semitic theory claiming that Jewish history didn't exist in the land of Israel. That is also denying who we are, denying our history. Demanding that Jews disavow Israel or Zionism, saying only our good Jews, as I mentioned before, can come into this space, not the bad Jews who won't disavow half the Jews in the world. Calling for the expulsion of Jews from Israel, and supporting violence against Jews, including Israeli Jews. So that's a very long list, but I want to say that my shorthand is that if you're not sure, ask yourself, what is another country that I'm really mad at? And could I put that country in this sentence and would it still make sense? Is this something that one could say about another country that is violating human rights? Or is this something that is actually bringing in anti-Semitic stereotypes, or that is crossing over from anger at a country and its policies into anti-Semitism? So again, criticism, public protest of Israel or any other country is really important for upholding human rights. And that is especially true in this moment when there is a seemingly never-ending war, though, please God, there will be a ceasefire soon, that is causing just horrific death, starvation, displacement in Gaza, where the hostages still, after nearly 2 years, haven't come home, when just the whole region is plunged into so much tragedy and so much pain. So we can protest that just as hundreds of thousands of Israelis are doing every Saturday night and times in between. But when this criticism expresses itself instead as violence toward Jews and Jewish institutions, including Jews who care about Israel and Israelis, that is anti-Semitism. So I know it's a complicated conversation. We probably didn't solve everything in this short time. We are, after all, bein hashmashot, in between things. But it is crucial that we find some clarity so that we can, in this really dangerous time, both ensure free speech and democracy for the long term, and also call out anti-Semitism and protect ourselves and all Jews from anti-Semitic acts when it is present. So thank you for engaging in this conversation. Shabbat Shalom.